The mother of the two missing children, Malehya Murray, has remained silent for months. No press appearances, no public statements, no renewed pleas for help. Why?
I'm just staying as hopeful as possible. I want them home. I want to hold them. And I want them home.
Did the RCMP ask the family to stay quiet? Or is she choosing to avoid the public eye? Only one interview with her has ever been recorded. And this is the only time we get to hear the mother's account in her own words. What she says in that interview, and especially what she doesn't say, may open up an entirely new direction in this case. This video is for analysis and commentary only. It does not accuse or place blame on anyone. If you follow mysterious and complex child-related cases, don't forget to subscribe to True Child Cases. Now, let's watch that rare interview once more before we begin our breakdown.
I'm just staying as hopeful as possible. I want them home. I want to hold them. And I want them home. What happened was we woke up, I heard them playing in the next room beside us, and I was drifting in and out of sleep, and they're not the type of kids that we tell them not to go outside on their own. We always make sure that we're out there with them, watching them, and they happen to just get out that sliding door, and we can't hear it when it opens. And they were outside playing, but we weren't aware of it at the time, and the next thing we knew, it was quiet. And we get up and I tell him, my partner, Daniel, I tell him, do you hear the kids? And he says, no. And we get up instantly. We're looking outside. We're looking everywhere, yelling for them. And I instantly just call 911. I just had the instinct I needed to call. They're both really go-lucky children. They're so sweet. They talk to anyone. They'll talk your ear off. They will speak to anyone in a store, everyone. They're just extremely sweet kids. I appreciate the huge search effort going on right now. But we've been pushing for an Amber Alert, which hasn't been issued. Not just that they could possibly be abducted, which it is a possibility that they could have been, but just an alert to let everyone know that they are missing. We had people text me saying that they weren't aware, someone else let them know that they were missing, and it would just be nice if everyone could be alerted. We thought maybe that we found tracks, but it's still uncertain. It's been raining and they're probably soaking wet, but with the sun today, I'm hopeful that they are feeling warm. We're all filled with pain and sorrow because we just want them found. We want them home. Everyone loves them. They are definitely verbal, and they do have possible autism, but it's not extreme autism. It's just they have issues with school, and they don't catch up with the other kids. I just want to remain hopeful. But there's always, in a mother's mind, you're always thinking the worst. Last night was one of the worst nights because I didn't have them in their beds. And I don't want to go through that another night without them.
In the interview, Malehya begins with a confident statement. We always make sure we're out there watching them. This line establishes a strong image of consistent supervision and suggests that the children were rarely, if ever, left unattended. It creates the expectation that the adults maintained close awareness of the children's whereabouts, setting a standard that frames the rest of her account and influences how viewers interpret the timeline she later describes. However, immediately afterward, she adds that she was drifting in and out of sleep. This admission introduces a notable contrast. The shift from a firm claim of constant oversight to a moment of reduced awareness raises questions about how closely the children were actually monitored that morning. The statement suggests a gap in attentiveness at a critical time, and this gap becomes important when reconstructing the window in which the children left the house without being noticed. Her next remark, "We didn't know they went outside," further widens this gap. It indicates not only reduced supervision, but complete unawareness of the children's movements. These three statements, claiming routine vigilance, acknowledging intermittent sleep, and admitting a lack of awareness, do not align smoothly when placed side by side. Analysts often identify such internal inconsistencies as points requiring clarification, not as definitive indicators of intent or blame. It is also important to consider the emotional environment of an interview like this. Stress, fatigue, and confusion can affect the clarity of a person's narrative, causing general statements to conflict with specific memories. A parent may rely on habitual descriptions. "We always watch them," even when recalling a moment that was an exception. The analytical approach, therefore, is not to assume deception, but to highlight where statements diverge from one another and why those divergences matter for understanding the sequence of events. From an investigative perspective, the tension between these statements creates uncertainty about the precise moment supervision lapsed. If the children typically required active monitoring, then a period of reduced attention becomes a significant detail. This inconsistency does not imply wrongdoing. Instead, it signals the need for corroborating information, such as witness accounts, environmental factors, or phone activity elements that help anchor the timeline more firmly than the verbal account alone. For analytical content, presenting these quotes consecutively helps viewers see how the narrative shifts within a short section of the interview. The goal is not to accuse, but to illustrate why investigators carefully examine inconsistencies when reconstructing movements, opportunities, and decision points. Highlighting such discrepancies shows how small differences in wording can influence interpretation, and why establishing a clear timeline is essential in any missing children case. In the interview, Malehya explains that the children slipped outside through the sliding door and adds that no one inside the home could hear it open. This detail appears early and is presented without prompting, as though anticipating a question from viewers about how the children left unnoticed. It functions as a practical explanation for a major gap in awareness, offering a mechanical reason rather than a situational one. Sliding doors usually produce at least a faint sound friction, track movement, or a shift in air pressure, so the claim naturally draws attention. In analytical contexts, such a statement becomes a point to verify rather than a conclusion. The condition of the door, background noise at the time, and the location of the adults in relation to the doorway all matter. This explanation may be accurate, but it invites further examination because it addresses a crucial moment in the narrative. What makes the line notable is the way it preemptively answers a potential objection. How did no one hear the children leave? By supplying that answer before it is asked, the speaker subtly redirects focus away from supervision lapses and toward an external factor, an unusually quiet door. This is not evidence of intent, but it does show how interviewees sometimes frame events to limit perceived responsibility, especially when recounting stressful or scrutinized situations. For content analysis, this detail is useful because it highlights how specific sensory claims shape public understanding of a timeline. The key takeaway is that such claims should be cross-referenced with physical evidence or witness accounts to confirm whether the door could realistically open without attracting attention. Presenting the line alongside a brief note about typical sliding door sounds can help viewers consider the difference between explanation and verification. A striking aspect of the interview is the absence of precise time markers. When describing the morning, Malehya does not specify what time she woke up, when she last heard the children playing, or at what point the house became unusually quiet. These missing anchors make it challenging to reconstruct the sequence of events. Without concrete time references, the narrative becomes broad and open-ended, leaving viewers without a clear understanding of how quickly the situation unfolded. Time is one of the most critical components in any missing person investigation. Precise timestamps help align a witness account with phone logs, camera footage, neighbor observations, or search team deployment records. The absence of such details in her description does not automatically signal wrongdoing, but it does raise the question of why key moments are described so vaguely. It shifts the burden onto investigators to fill in gaps with external evidence rather than relying on the speaker's own recollection. Her statements remain centered on sensations rather than chronology. She recalls hearing the children, drifting in and out of sleep, and noticing sudden silence, but without tying these events to a timeline. This type of narrative structure can occur when someone recounts emotionally overwhelming events. Yet analysts also note that avoiding specific times can reduce the risk of contradictions with independently verifiable data. It becomes a stylistic choice with analytical implications. The absence of time markers also limits the ability to assess response speed. For example, she says she instantly called emergency services, but without knowing the exact moment she discovered the silence. Viewers cannot determine how long the children were unaccounted for before help was contacted. This ambiguity does not inherently imply misrepresentation, but it highlights the importance of correlating her statements with call records and police arrival logs to refine the timeline. In content analysis, it is useful to contrast what is said with what remains undefined. When an interview provides emotional detail but avoids measurable data, analysts flag the narrative gaps for further review. This helps identify which parts of the timeline depend solely on memory and which require external confirmation. The goal is not to accuse, but to illustrate how missing details can complicate the reconstruction of critical windows of opportunity, both for the children's movements and the adults' actions. For your video, visually representing the timeline with blank time slots can help viewers grasp the extent of what remains unspecified. This approach keeps the tone factual and neutral, while emphasizing why time-specific clarity is important in understanding any missing children case. By encouraging the audience to notice the lack of timestamps, you highlight a pattern that investigators routinely examine. Whether the absence of detail stems from stress, imperfect memory, or narrative choices that leave room for interpretation. In her interview, Malehya uses a notably strong word to describe her reaction after realizing the children were gone. She says she instantly called 911. The choice of this adverb is striking because it conveys a sense of perfect, immediate action. These missing anchors make it challenging to reconstruct the sequence of events. Without concrete time references, Tit paints a picture of absolute responsiveness, positioning her as someone who reacted exactly as expected in a crisis. This type of wording is worth examining because it shapes how the public interprets her level of urgency. Narrative becomes broad and open-ended, leaving viewers without a clear understanding of how quickly the situation unfolded. In emotionally charged situations, people often describe their actions in simplified or amplified terms. However, the use of a definitive word like instantly leans more toward evaluation than description. It communicates not just what she did, but how she wants that action to be understood. The emphasis on speed reinforces an image of full responsibility and attentiveness, even though earlier statements suggested moments of reduced awareness. This contrast becomes analytically meaningful. When evaluating such phrasing, analysts look at how it fits into the broader narrative context. In this interview, time-related details are largely absent, yet the timing of the emergency call is described with absolute certainty. That imbalance, vague recollections in some areas and definitive claims in others can indicate a desire to reassure the audience about specific actions, especially those related to safety or response. It does not imply any wrongdoing, but it highlights narrative priorities. From an investigative standpoint, claims about emergency calls are highly verifiable through phone logs and dispatch records. These external documents provide precise timestamps that can confirm or clarify the sequence she describes. By comparing her verbal emphasis with objective data, analysts can better understand whether instantly reflects perceived or literal timing. This distinction is valuable because memory under stress often compresses events, making reactions feel faster than they were. The rhetorical weight of the word also merits attention. When someone repeats that they acted immediately, it can serve to protect against scrutiny, intentionally or unintentionally, by reinforcing an image of diligence. In interviews related to crisis events, such reinforcement is common, especially when the speaker anticipates public questions about their behavior. Highlighting this linguistic choice in your video helps viewers understand how language subtly shapes public perception. For your production, isolating the phrase on screen and pairing it with a reminder that perceived speed and actual speed can differ keeps the analysis balanced. You can also suggest that emergency call logs, if publicly referenced, would provide clarity about the actual timeline. This educates viewers on how investigators cross-check statements while maintaining a respectful, neutral tone. Ultimately, the emphasis on instantly is less about suspicion and more about understanding how words can frame a narrative. Early in the interview, shortly after recounting the moment she realized the children were gone, Malehya shifts into a long and emotionally warm description of their personalities. She talks about how go-lucky and friendly they are, how they would talk to anyone, and how sweet and affectionate they can be. This transition moves the focus away from the morning's events and toward endearing character details, which naturally evoke sympathy from viewers. From a narrative perspective, this shift is understandable. Parents under stress often cling to positive memories as a way to cope with fear and uncertainty. However, in analytical review, the placement of these descriptions is notable. They appear precisely at the point where more factual clarity about timing and actions would normally be expected. Instead of expanding on the circumstances, she expands on the children themselves, foregrounding emotion over logistics. This type of emotional emphasis is common in public interviews involving missing children. It helps humanize the children, encourages public empathy, and may rally community support. At the same time, analysts observe when emotional content begins to overshadow factual explanation, because it can influence how the narrative is perceived. Audiences may shift their focus from practical questions to emotional resonance, which shapes the overall impact of the interview. In communication analysis, this technique is sometimes described as a form of context reframing. The speaker guides listeners toward a warm emotional landscape, which can soften scrutiny or reduce attention to unanswered questions. Again, this is not a claim of intent, but a recognition of how emotional storytelling functions. Viewers naturally respond strongly to descriptions of children's innocence and charm, sometimes more strongly than to procedural details. For investigators, these emotional sections provide less actionable information than time-specific or behavior-specific accounts. They don't clarify when the quiet moment was noticed, what steps followed, or how long the adults searched before calling for assistance. Highlighting this difference in your video between emotive material and fact-building material helps viewers understand why certain lines are touching but do not advance the effort to reconstruct the timeline. In your production, you can illustrate this by displaying the personality-focused quotes and contrasting them with unanswered logistical questions. This allows viewers to appreciate the emotion while also recognizing the narrative shift. The analytical takeaway is simple and neutral. Emotional descriptions enrich the story, but may divert attention from critical details. And identifying this shift helps clarify which parts of the interview contribute to understanding the event sequence. In the interview, Malehya repeatedly stresses the need for an Amber Alert and raises the possibility that the children may have been taken. This emphasis stands out because it appears early in the conversation and resurfaces multiple times, even though she also describes the children's tracks being found near the property. The frequency of this point suggests she wanted the audience to consider an external factor as a credible scenario from the outset. At the time of the interview, no evidence had been publicly confirmed regarding the presence of unfamiliar individuals, vehicles, or items suggesting third-party involvement. Nevertheless, the mother frames abduction as a real possibility, not merely as a remote concern. This creates a contrast between the factual information available and the scenario she urges the public to acknowledge, making this one of the most analytically notable elements of her statement. In communication analysis, this kind of framing is often examined under the concept of narrative direction. A speaker may steer listeners toward or away from certain interpretations, intentionally or not, by repeating specific themes. Here, the repeated focus on an external threat shifts attention outward, rather than toward detailed reconstruction of events inside the home. Analysts typically note such shifts as rhetorical patterns rather than as indicators of intent. It is important to remain neutral. A parent facing uncertainty may genuinely fear all possibilities, including external involvement, especially if the children are outgoing or inclined to approach strangers. Her references to the children being friendly could reinforce her concern that someone might have interacted with them. From this angle, the mention of abduction reflects emotional distress rather than an attempt to shape the narrative strategically. However, analysts also consider how repeated suggestions of outside involvement can influence public perception. By emphasizing the Amber Alert request, Malehya highlights a scenario that requires external responsibility and potentially diverts attention from clarifying details about the children's movements, the home environment, and adult supervision that morning. This redirection is subtle, but analytically relevant when reviewing the structure of her interview. For your video, presenting her statements alongside the absence of confirmed external indicators helps viewers understand the gap between the emotional framing and the documented facts. The takeaway is not accusatory. It is simply that narrative emphasis can guide audience focus, and identifying these shifts allows for a clear examination of which elements of the interview advance the factual timeline and which introduce speculative alternatives. In the interview, Malehya mentions a distinctive detail: Lilly's white backpack with strawberry patterns. Naming a specific item suggests recent or clear observation, either from the last time she saw the child or from memory of what the child usually has. Details like this help listeners visualize the children and can aid search efforts if such items are lost or found. The specific mention adds texture to her account. Shortly after, she says she does not believe the children were carrying backpacks when they went outside. That second claim introduces a direct tension. Why name a precise item and then suggest it likely did not leave the house with the child? From an analytical standpoint, it is useful to treat these as two separate kinds of statements, one descriptive of ownership and the other speculative about present possession, but the juxtaposition still reads as inconsistent. Memory under stress can produce this kind of mixed messaging. A parent might recall a frequently used item, the white strawberry backpack, while simultaneously acknowledging uncertainty about whether it accompanied the child that morning. Analysts typically note that naming an item implies some level of confidence, whereas hedging about its presence signals uncertainty. The combination, therefore, invites follow-up rather than immediate judgment. For investigators and content creators, the productive question is operational. Were the backpacks recovered or accounted for by search teams? Was the backpack listed in any initial evidence logs? Presenting the two lines together in your video, first the specific item, then the uncertainty, frames a clear research task. Verify which claim, if either, aligns with physical evidence documented by responders. Another consideration is phrasing and conversational flow. In spoken interviews, people often reference familiar objects to help listeners connect emotionally, even if the present status of those objects is uncertain. The narrative function of the backpack detail may be as much about humanizing Lilly as about reporting inventory. Highlighting this helps viewers distinguish between evocative detail and verifiable fact. In production, juxtapose the quotes on screen and end with a neutral prompt. Which of these statements is supported by evidence? That encourages viewers to seek corroboration from official reports rather than drawing conclusions from a single, potentially conflicted verbal account. The analytical aim is clarity. Mark the inconsistency, explain why it matters for reconstruction, and point toward verification steps. In the interview, Malehya briefly mentions that the children may have possible autism, but not extreme. This phrase introduces a developmental consideration that could affect how the children might respond to stress, unfamiliar environments, or separation from adults. The statement is broad and undefined, leaving open a wide range of interpretations about what behaviors she believes fall within this description and how consistently such behaviors appear in daily life. Immediately after raising this possibility, however, she describes the children as highly social. They would talk to anyone. They were very go-lucky, and they were super verbal. These characterizations paint a picture of outgoing, expressive children traits that do not contradict autism entirely, but do contrast with common public assumptions about it. The juxtaposition of these descriptors becomes analytically notable because the interview does not clarify how these traits coexist. It is important to acknowledge that autism is a broad spectrum. Children can be verbal, friendly, and socially open while still experiencing developmental or sensory differences. Yet in narrative analysis, when a speaker raises a condition and then immediately provides traits associated with the opposite perception, the result can feel internally inconsistent. The contrast invites questions about which aspects reflect clinical considerations and which reflect everyday personality. One analytical interpretation is that the mother may be trying to explain two different possibilities at once. The idea that the children might wander because of developmental tendencies, and the idea that they might approach strangers because they are highly social. These two explanations, although not mutually exclusive, create different implications for understanding how the children might behave if unsupervised. The interview does not reconcile these differing scenarios. From a search-response standpoint, behavioral clarity matters. If the children are superverbal, search teams might expect them to call out or respond when approached. If they have traits associated with the autism spectrum, they might react unpredictably or avoid engagement. Highlighting this dual portrayal in your analysis helps viewers see why investigators rely on consistent behavioral profiles, because mixed descriptions complicate predictions about the children's movements and reactions. For your video, you can present the two sets of statements side by side to illustrate the tension between them. Emphasize that the goal is not to question the mother's intentions, but to show how mixed descriptors can create uncertainty about behavioral expectations. By pointing out this inconsistency, you provide viewers with a clear example of how narrative complexity can influence both public interpretation and operational decision-making in a missing children case. In the interview, when Malehya describes the exact moment she realized the children were missing, her tone appears restrained and minimal. She summarizes the situation in broad terms, without vivid emotional detail or expressive emphasis. This reserved delivery contrasts with what some viewers might expect in a moment describing sudden distress. While emotional responses vary widely among individuals, the sparse tone naturally attracts analytical attention because it shapes how the account is perceived. A similar pattern appears when she describes running to search for the children. The narrative remains general and concise, focusing on actions rather than feelings. She recounts looking around, calling their names, and deciding to contact emergency services, but does not elaborate on the internal emotional experience of that moment. Again, this is not unusual on its own, but it contributes to an overall impression of emotional distance during critical points in the timeline. In contrast, When she speaks about the children's personalities, especially when saying, "They're so sweet," her tone becomes noticeably softer and more expressive. The warmth in her voice increases, and her phrasing becomes more detailed. This shift creates a clear emotional contrast between parts of the interview that describe the crisis itself and parts that describe who the children are. Analysts often mark such differences because they influence how listeners interpret the speaker's emotional state. It is important to emphasize that emotional expression is deeply individual. Some people become flat or dissociated when describing overwhelming events, while showing more emotion when discussing memories or personal qualities. The contrast does not inherently indicate dishonesty. Rather, it provides insight into how a speaker organizes and processes different types of information. In analytical commentary, acknowledging this nuance is essential for maintaining fairness and accuracy. Still, tonal shifts can be informative when examining how a narrative is structured. Emotion appearing in less event-critical sections, but remaining muted during key moments, may direct audience attention toward certain themes, such as the children's innocence, while leaving significant situational details less explored. For content analysis, the practical value lies in identifying where emotional emphasis is placed and how that emphasis shapes the viewer's understanding of the timeline. For your video, you can present short audio or transcript excerpts demonstrating the contrast between these tones. By framing the observation neutrally, emotional emphasis appears here rather than here. You allow viewers to consider how tone affects interpretation without implying any intent. This approach highlights an important analytical principle. Emotional distribution in a narrative can influence perception, and examining where it appears helps clarify how the story is constructed. Throughout the interview, one noticeable pattern is the repetition of certain phrases, especially when Malehya describes the children's interests. Her lines about Jack loving bugs, dinosaurs, and anything like that appear almost verbatim more than once. While repetition can occur naturally in conversation, the degree of similarity between these expressions draws attention, as it suggests that the lines may come from a familiar, pre-formed description rather than spontaneous recollection in the moment. A similar pattern appears when she describes the search efforts. She repeats the idea of surveying every dirt road, every culvert in nearly identical language, even within a short time span. In natural storytelling, people often add new details or shift emphasis when recounting the same event. However, here the phrasing remains tightly consistent. This consistency does not imply any wrongdoing, but it is a characteristic that analysts often mark when assessing how an individual structures their narrative. Repetition can serve different functions. It may reflect stress, an attempt to stay composed, or a desire to avoid introducing details that might be inaccurate or uncertain. People sometimes repeat the safest parts of their memory to maintain control in an overwhelming situation. At the same time, repetition can also arise when someone relies on memorized lines or public-facing statements prepared earlier. The analytical goal is simply to recognize this pattern and consider what factors might contribute to it. In contrast, spontaneous recollection usually evolves slightly with each retelling. A speaker might add a sensory detail, rearrange the order of actions, or qualify a statement as they reflect more deeply. The absence of such evolution does not prove the narrative is scripted, but it does suggest that certain lines may have been repeated many times before the interview or rehearsed in the speaker's mind. This distinction becomes useful for understanding how the interviewee prioritizes and controls their message. For investigators and analysts, these repetitive patterns serve primarily as prompts for further verification. If certain phrases appear highly polished, they may align with prepared public statements or prior interviews, making it worthwhile to check whether similar wording appears elsewhere. This helps determine whether the repeated lines reflect consistent truthfulness, emotional coping, or simple reliance on a familiar script. The analysis remains focused on narrative structure rather than concluding intent. In your video, you can highlight this pattern by placing the repeated quotes side by side on screen. Emphasize how repetition affects interpretation. It may make a narrative feel stable, but it can also limit insight into unspoken or evolving details. Present the observation neutrally. Repetition may indicate comfort with certain lines, while reminding viewers that many factors, including stress, can shape how a person tells their story. This approach keeps the analysis balanced, informative, and aligned with best practices for responsible commentary. As we reach the end of this analysis, it becomes clear that every interview, every detail, and every shift in tone offers pieces of a much larger puzzle. The goal of this breakdown is not to draw conclusions, but to highlight patterns that may help viewers think critically about the information presented. Cases involving missing children are complex, emotional, and often filled with unanswered questions. Our purpose is to examine the available material thoughtfully while respecting everyone involved. The interview we explored today remains one of the few public insights into the family's perspective. By looking closely at wording, structure, and emphasis, we gain a clearer understanding of how narratives form and how they influence public perception. These observations do not determine guilt or innocence. Rather, they illustrate the importance of careful listening and objective review. In cases like these, clarity grows only when we look at each piece of information with patience and awareness. There is always more to learn and more angles to explore, and your engagement helps keep these conversations active. Every watch, like, and comment supports deeper analysis and encourages broader awareness for cases that need attention. So please consider subscribing to True Child Cases for more investigations, updates, and thoughtful discussions on missing children's cases around the world. Your support allows us to continue producing detailed, respectful, and well-researched content. And as always, stay curious, stay critical, and stay compassionate. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.